Hello, and today we will continue our lectures on special education needs students. Today we focus on the issue of teaching a foreign language to visually impaired learners. Well, let's start from posing the question, what do all these people that are in these photos have in common? I guess that you recognize some of them. That is Louis Braille, a famous French man who actually invented Braille. Braille is a system that is based on embossed dots, 6 dots. Actually, it's a kind of alphabet that is used by people who are blind. There is Andrea Bocelli. I guess that you heard about this man. He's not a typical congenitally blind person, meaning he was not blind from the very beginning since he was born, right? But he lost his sight at some point of his life when he was hit by a ball, right, during a football match. There is Stevie Wonder. I guess that you recognize the guy, and some other famous, multi-instrumentalists, musicians, right? Ray Charles, and Homer, the famous Greek philosopher, who is said to be blind. And there is also the picture of a man at the bottom. This is Eric Weichenmeyer. He's very famous for, his outstanding achievement. Namely, he is actually the first guy who reached the summit of Mount Everest. It's a very outstanding achievement, especially if you take into consideration the fact that, he's blind. And there is also the picture of a woman on the right. Well, this is our famous Helen Keller. Helen Keller, who was deaf and blind. She's famous for her outstanding achievements, and she's actually she was the first woman who was deaf and blind who obtained PhD degree. And she is, of course, she was a very famous advocate for the blind and for the deaf people, and generally people with all disabilities. So what do these all people have in common? Either this is vision loss or vision deficit. But what is more, all these people, they achieved some kind of success. So as you can see, vision loss or vision deficit is not any obstacle in achieving success. The same actually applies to foreign language. And very briefly, let's focus on the aim of the lecture. Well, there are basically 3 points. Number 1, to sensitize you as future foreign language teachers to the problems of visually impaired students. Well, throughout this lecture, I will use an abbreviation VI that stands for visually impaired. And number 2, to give you some guidelines on how to deal with visually impaired students in a classroom. So some practical hints, what you may do in a classroom. And finally, a little bit of theory, right? So I'll give some basic knowledge of Tiflo education and Tiflo methodology of foreign language teaching. I guess that you are not familiar with these 2 words, Tiflo education, Tiflo methodology. These 2 words, they refer to, recently developed, emerged branch of science that deals with education of the blind or partially sighted learners. This coinage is related to the word tiflos, which in Greek means blind. And now let's clarify some basic terms related to Tiflo education or Tiflo methodology of foreign language teaching. There are 3 categories of learners that we will be talking about in this lecture. Well, the first, blind learners, right? I will use an abbreviation BL. Blind learners might be either congenitally blind, as you remember, these are the learners who are blind since the very moment they were born, right? Or adventitiously blind, which means that at some point of their lives, well, due to some accident, right, they lost their sight, their vision. There are also partially sighted learners, PSL, this is an abbreviation that I will be using throughout the lecture, which refers to low vision learners, right? So learners who, due to some infectious diseases or various accidents, they lost, but not totally their sight, but they were able to retain some part of vision. And there is also a very broad term, let's say a kind of an umbrella term, that is visually impaired. Well, this umbrella term is used to refer to both groups of learners, namely blind and partially sighted learners. And finally, let me pay your attention to the fact that when we are talking about any deficits nowadays, whether we are talking about people suffering from dyslexia or ADHD, we do not use anymore a term handicap, and the same applies to visually impaired learners. Nowadays, instead of a term handicap, it's more politically correct, right, to use a word impaired. So we are not talking about disabilities, handicaps, but we are talking about visual impairment. Well, you may ask me the question, why are you talking about visually impaired people? It will not refer to me, to my teaching practice. Well, before I will provide you with the answer to this question, first of all, let's have a look at some basic facts about visual impairment in the world. So these are the facts. There are 285 million people in the world who are visually impaired. But this is the data that is obtained from World Health Organization. Have a look, there are 39 million of people in the world who are blind and 246 who have low vision. So they are partially sighted, right? What is more, 90% of visual impaired people, they live in developing countries. What we may observe when we have a look at statistics of visual impairment, it is actually, there are two kinds of trends, two tendencies. On the one hand, since the very beginning of the 90s of the 20th century, we may observe that the number of people with visual impairment decreased. It's due to a number of factors. Mostly it's because of the public health that is nowadays much, much better than it used to be in the past. Especially this decrease in visual impairment is observable in the case of infectious diseases. But on the other hand, we have some other type of data that shows just the opposite trend. So what happens is that nowadays, due to, development of technology, right, advances in neonatal medicine, there are many babies, increasingly premature babies, whose lives are saved. And at the same time, there is a higher risk for these babies to suffer from either partial or total lack of vision. So, consequently, the population of visual impaired children and learners, right, is greater than before. And now let's have a look at some facts about visual impairment in Poland. So, when I had to look at Central Office of Statistics data for 2010, I found information that there is almost 1,820,000 blind and partially sighted people in our country. When I tried to compare this information with the data that is available at the website of Polish Association of the Blind, I found, a huge difference. Because PAB holds that this population of people with visual impairment estimates at 63,514. So there is a great discrepancy, which, well, it may be explained in this way that not all people who are blind or partially sighted who are included in this data of Central Office of Statistics, that are not members of PAB, right? So you may be blind, but you don't have to be a member of Polish Association of the Blind. And now let's have a look at more interesting data, namely the data related to education enrollments. So in 2010, there were 1,927 enrollments at a primary school, so quite a lot, 1,298 at the grammar school level, and, well, 1,144 at the secondary and vocation school level. So today we focus on specific needs of the learners who are at a primary, grammar school, secondary and vocation school level. So now let's come back to the question that I posed at the very beginning. Why should we, well, have any knowledge about teaching for languages to visually impaired learners? Well, I gave you some facts, but still you may say, well, it does not refer to me. I'm a foreign language teacher in the mainstream education system. Well, actually, it's more complicated. Well, have a look at the first point. Nowadays, in the European Union, we have education system that is called inclusion. It's inclusive education system. Inclusion policy is nowadays an objective for all the member state countries, which means that all the children, regardless of their disabilities, that are integrated with other, in inverted commas, normal children, right? So sighted children are in the mainstream education together with blind or partially sighted children. If we have a look at some more data, well, the majority of Polish pupils with vision deficit or loss, they opt for a regular school. Have a look at data. 73% of the learners who are blind and partially sighted, they prefer regular schools, which means that there is a great likelihood for you to have in your classroom a person like this. And now let's focus on foreign language education and visual impairment. When there are no doubts that the right to education is guaranteed to all the children, all the learners, regardless of their disabilities. And this is what is guaranteed by the European legislation. United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities opened a kind of a new era for disabled people. There is very important part in this convention that refers also to visual impaired people. The most important point is that equality in education is the primary objective of all the countries within the European Union. As to our country, Poland signed this convention on 3rd of March 2007. What are the implications for us as teachers? Well, first of all, foreign language classes are compulsory for all the students. Once again, regardless of their disabilities. And it is not just in Poland, but it is in all European Union countries. Let's try to answer the question, why should visually impaired people learn foreign languages? Well, definitely, the short answer would be, well, for the same reasons as their sighted counterparts do it. because language opens new opportunities, right? Because it gives opportunity of meeting people, having access to cultural diversity, experiencing personal fulfillment, and so on, right? Language skills nowadays are treated as core skills that all citizens within European Union should be able to learn and update throughout their lives, regardless his or her impairment or disability. We may say that foreign language learning for blind or partially sighted people compensates for sensory deprivation, psychological deprivation, because, that's obvious that if you don't see, it has a great impact on your affective domain, on your psyche, right? These learners frequently have problems with motivation, with self-esteem. They do not believe that they may attain anything in life. And foreign language learning also compensates for social deprivation, which means that learning foreign languages gives them an opportunity to socialize, all right? To talk with other people, by watching different movies, let's say, right? Having a chat on internet. And finally, communication deprivation, that is, closely related to social deprivation. But this compensation is a very important point in our discussion about visual impairment. People who are deprived of their vision, instead of sitting at home and doing nothing, right? They have something in their lives, they may set some objectives in their lives, right? They may pursue these aims, these objectives. They may be as happy as their sighted counterparts. Well, let's have a look at some more arguments for exposing visual impaired learners to foreign languages. But definitely, it gives them some job opportunities, which is especially important in societies with a high degree of economic interaction. What is more, blind and partially sighted people who know perfectly language, foreign language, they may be more mobile within the European Union. So they may, one day pack up their things and go to Great Britain or Ireland, right? Definitely, the command of English is a highly valued asset, and it's not just the case in the case of sighted people, but also in the blind people. I would even say that it's more important for visually impaired people, because frequently they need to work more than others to be appreciated and to have the same job opportunities as sighted people, right? It's not actually the myth that visually impaired people have a good ear for languages, right? They somehow compensate loss of vision with perfect hearing. So no wonder that they make actually excellent foreign language learners, right? So definitely lack of vision is not an obstacle to master successfully a foreign language. I would say even more that they might be better and surpass sighted counterparts because they have better memory, right? And they also have better perceptual mode, which means they are more sensitive to sounds. I don't want to quote any, research findings, but there is some data that shows that visually impaired people, they actually surpass their sighted counterparts in foreign language learning, especially in phonological domain, right? It's because of this perfect hearing. And, well, I guess that's obvious that if they are good in foreign languages, they try to pursue their career in this domain. So there are more and more blind and partially sighted people who are graduates from model language departments or teachers training colleges. And, well, they work in their lives as professional interpreters or language teachers. And now let's focus on the issue of learning and vision. What is the interdependence between learning and vision? I guess that in order to teach someone effectively, first of all, we need to understand the nature of the learning process. Well, definitely, this learning process in the case of a visual impaired person looks differently than the learning process in a sighted learner. We live in the world of vision. There are no doubts about it, right? But what is bad news? It is the fact that educational system is nowadays basically based on vision. If you open up any books, foreign language books, any course books, right, there are lots of colorful pictures, beautiful charts, right, diagrams. And actually this is this visual input that is stimulating for learners. But now the question arises, what about visually impaired people, especially blind people who are not able to see any pictures in the book? Let's come back to the very term of learning. There are some cognitive differences between visually impaired and sighted children. This is what we know from the number of different, well, research. I don't want to say that visually impaired children are worse, that they are not intelligent, because that's not true. There are some situations in which vision is accompanied, the loss of vision is accompanied with some other losses. And in these cases, indeed, the students might have problems not just with, well, seeing the pictures in the book, but also with understanding what is in the book. If you have a look at these two diagrams, you may see that there are two stages in our lives. There is the stage that is called concrete terms emergence stage and abstract terms stage. And surprisingly enough, in the case of blind learners, this stage related to abstract terms occurs much earlier than in the case of sighted learners. Well, this is a very important information for us as teachers. Contrary to popular beliefs, the blind children may understand many abstract terms, but now another question is, do they understand it in the way that we do? At this stage of our deliberations about visual impairment and learning for languages, let's pose a question. Does cognition depend on experiences? In other words, can we expect from a child, from a learner who is normally sighted person, the same learning as it is in the case of a person who is partially sighted or blind? Let's have a look at the first example. Well, this is a tactile picture of a bus. If you assign the same task to a child who is normally sighted, well, you may expect a prototypical picture of a bus. So there are some four wheels, there are some seats, right? There is a bus driver. But for a child who actually never had this real experience of a bus, a picture of a bus looks like this. There are just two lines. Okay, the first line refers to your experience related to touching what? The stir, right? And the second one relates to your experience, the one that is related to, well, holding your hand on a kind of a handle, right? You may ask the questions, do blind people really know what a given concept means? Well, the problem is that it takes some time for either parents or teachers to explain to visually impaired children what a given word means. So, what a rainbow looks like? Well, a child who is blind, congenitally blind, does not have any idea of this concept of rainbow. So you need to explain to a child what it is. Or do they know what darkness is? Well, it's really difficult to explain what darkness is, especially that darkness is in opposition to something that is not dark, alright? So if you are not able to perceive any colors, how can you say what darkness is? Below you have the questions. These are the questions that I've taken from the book by Krzeszowski, Marek and Piskarowska on teaching foreign languages, on teaching English precisely, right, to the learners with vision loss or vision deficit. Jakiego koloru jest wiatr? Czy kamień wygląda tak samo jak wtedy, gdy się go dotyka? Już wiem, jak ryby pływają, ale jak one chodzą? Jak to możliwe, że widzisz wielką górę przez małe okno? Jeśli widzisz mnie przez zamknięte okno, to dlaczego mówisz, że nie widzisz mnie przez ścianę? Byłam przekonana, że samoloty machają skrzydłami, kiedy lecą. What is really surprising is the fact that the last sentence was produced by a blind person who is actually adult. It's not a child. All these questions are very important for us as teachers. Frequently, we as foreign language teachers, we need to face the reality, namely that our blind students do not understand some basic concepts in their native language. So before we introduce any words, any concepts in the target language, we need to explain or clarify or elicit from the students whether they really understand this word, this concept in their mother. And these are implications for foreign language teaching. Well, I actually partly discussed these implications. So we know that there are some gaps in the knowledge about the world. So we as foreign language teachers, especially when we have congenitally blind students in our classroom, first of all, we need to check whether he or she understands the concept in the native language. To give you more examples, when I was talking to an adult person and we were covering the text about the Second World War, and this person, this learner was surprised to discover that the word a war is not related to any horses. So actually the question that appeared from this adult learner of English was, why there are no warriors on horses? So this adult learner had a misconception of the term war. So a war was for him a kind of a battle. Well, definitely there is the lack of vision. The blind student needs to use other sensory channels. Teachers should mainly focus on auditory channel. So what they say, how they say, how we put the message across to their students. These learners also use tactile mode, which means that they get to know reality by the sense of touch, all right? Which is another implication for foreign language teachers. We as teachers should introduce various realia, right? Real life objects. When we are talking about vegetables or fruits, right? we should bring into the classroom real objects and allow our students to touch them. Vision area is taken over by other senses, definitely, and they need lots of stimulation from teachers and parents. There might be some impression of delay. This is actually the point that I made before, but I think it does an impression. If there is the blind student, blind learner, who just had problem with vision loss, and there are no other disabilities that are involved, definitely he or she should not be delayed in linguistic abilities. Well, let's have a look at some myths about the learning process and visually impaired learners. Well, the first myth is that all blind students they have low IQ, that they are not intelligent, and consequently they are low achievers. What is more, they are not able to be autonomous, which means that they are passive, not responsible for the process of learning, and they need all the time to have either a parent or a teacher to say what to do, what not to do. But definitely these are the myths that need to be dispelled. The facts are that the blind students, they might be high achievers, especially in foreign language learning. As you remember, especially in phonological domain, they may be as good as their sighted counterparts, or they may even surpass the sighted people. Another fact is that they rely on auditory and tactile mode. So maybe they are not able to write anything or to read out the text from the course book, alright? But they may listen to the text if you read it out. Definitely they might have problems with self-esteem and motivation. I made this point before, that the vision loss, it's a very traumatic experience, which has a great impact on affectivity, on emotional domain of a person. That's why we as teachers, we need to, motivate these students all the time, and by means of different techniques, make them believe in their abilities. But personally, I would describe this learning process, this learning path, as a kind of a stony road, a road that is just like in this picture, full of different, obstacles on the way. These obstacles are related, well, either to the person of a teacher who does not understand the needs of such a student, or it may be related to, well, some institutional barriers, for instance, these related to the course books. There are not many resources that are on the market that are offered to visually impaired students. Well, there is 1 or 2 English course books that are prepared in Braille. So, well, there is this, equality for all education, but at the same time, they are not treated equally. And for all these reasons, problems with course books, problems with teachers, right? Problems with different resources. This learning path is a very stony road, but I guess that very. Before we focus on some practical implications for you as foreign language teachers, let's try to make some final conclusions on what we already discussed. The most important conclusion is that visually impaired learners, they lose only their sight but not their vision to see the world, which means that they are capable of learning, capable of learning about the reality, right? Getting new experiences. Of course, on condition that other senses are intact. And teachers should realize that it's not that without vision there is no possibility of learning anything. What is more, visually impaired people, they are able to develop and utilize these remaining senses. They may hear and they may touch. And their learning process is very much tied up with culture, exposure and experiences. It might happen that a visually impaired person living in one country will not have the same experiences as a person who is blind but lives in a totally different, is surrounded by a totally different culture. The same applies to students' autonomy. Students who are surrounded by parents, overprotective teachers, will definitely will be having this learning process more difficult than these learners who are made very independent from the very beginning. And another conclusion is that blind students may not be able to acquire new experiences to the same extent as sighted students. And finally, teachers of the blind may have to go an extra edge than other teachers, which means that definitely, if you happen to have a blind student in your classroom, what you know just from modern languages department, from your psychology classes, will not be sufficient knowledge to work with such a student. What we need to do is bring experiences and exposure to the blind students all the time. So what can we do as foreign language teachers? Well, first of all, we need to realize that there are absolutely no differences in methods or approaches of foreign language teaching when we are talking about sighted or blind or partially sighted students. The only difference is in techniques. There are no differences in objectives of learning, in aims of teaching, in approaches, which means that communication in line with the communicative approach is priority for both sighted people, for sighted learners, and blind learners. The only thing that you need to remember about is that we need to adjust the techniques that we use for specific tasks in a classroom. These techniques need to be adjusted to visually impaired learners. Well, you may say, well, I don't know Braille, so how can I prepare any resources for my students? There are lots of possibilities that you may do it. We will discuss it in a minute. Now, let's have a look at the next point, positive motivational feedback. For the reasons that I discussed before, they have, as you remember, low motivation, low self-esteem. We need to, cater for the needs of these learners all the time, give them rewards, focus more on the things that they do correctly and not on their errors. And we should also develop their autonomy. It's the myth that visually impaired people are passive. Some of them really are, but it's not that they want to be passive. But the people who actually surround the blind students, they take for granted that this is what they like, that they want to be dependent on others. But that's not true. All people want to be independent. All people want to work on their own. And the same applies to the blind students. How can we develop their independence, autonomy in a classroom? We may do it, for instance, by the introduction of ELP. I guess that you remember a term from our previous lectures. ELP stands for European Language Portfolio. That is a version of ELP for the blind and visually impaired learners. It's available, of course, online, because this is the only way that they may actually fill in all these charts. We also encourage our students to use technology. Nowadays, there is such a, modern technology allows to do all the things with the text. We'll be talking about this new technology in a minute. And finally, we may introduce various projects. Allow your students to prepare something at home. Allow your students to do something with other people, with parents, with their peers. And encourage the students to self-assessment. As you remember, project self-assessment, these are actually the... And now for language teachers and adaptive technology. Well, definitely you don't have to learn Braille. The fact is that nowadays there are more and more blind students who are not capable of using Braille. But I guess that it's necessary to know what Braille is, just in case you had a student, who was actually using Braille. So Braille is the alphabet that was introduced by Louis Braille in France, which is based on 6 dots. The combination of these 6 dots makes the letters of alphabet. Of course, all these points, dots, are embossed, so they may be touched by a blind person and read out in the same way as a sighted person reads out text. We as teachers, we should encourage computer-aided learning, all right? Do not torture your students with reading out, the text in Braille, because it's really time-consuming and the students may, get discouraged that they are not as fast as, sighted people. You may advise to your students to use speech software such as JAWS that refers to job access with speech. And there is also a software program, that a popular one, that is called Kurzweil, which enables users to scan in books and read out the text quickly. Well, I guess that technology is really a great thing because it gives an opportunity to a blind student to be, to work, to learn foreign languages at the same rate as his or her sighted counterparts. And now the last issue is related to assessment. Even at university level, there are more and more students who are blind, and the problem is with assessment. Can we assess them in the same way as sighted people? But definitely, you should not change the way that you assess all the students. But if it is possible to use technology for examining students' progress, I think it's a good idea to do it. Well, firstly, because the students will be not anxious so much as it is in the situation that when they have to write a traditional test. Moreover, that they do it in Braille. And what is more, another argument for using technology for final exams with bright students is confidence. So the blind student feels more confident when he or she is given some extra time for writing the test, and at the same time and now some other hints for you. Pay attention to details while teaching. But definitely the blind student is not able to see what you write on the board, right? But his hearing is as good as yours, or maybe even better. So try to keep him somehow updated with all the steps that you take in a classroom. So if you come up to the board, just say it. I'm approaching the board. If you distribute any handouts, explain what you do. On the left-hand corner of your page, you write the address. So in a written assignment related to writing formal or informal letters, you should say very, very precisely what a person is supposed to do. The same applies to your interaction with the blind student in a classroom. It's not appropriate to come up to your student and suddenly, grip his arm, right? But first of all, you should produce a sentence such as, now I'm approaching you and I'll be asking you a question. So think about all these small details, all this communication, all this information is very important for Well, it may happen that you want to introduce in your classroom some plans or diagrams or other resources that are not included in the course book. Don't worry, you may do them, on your own. You may, for instance, emboss them for your students by sticking string to cardboard or use professional wiki sticks. If you have a look at these pictures, you may see the student who is actually working with his English teacher on intonation pattern. Once again, you may do it with sticking string or anything, or with professional wiki sticks. It might happen that you need to explain to students various aspects related to texture. The best idea is to use real objects like a metal button, a plastic button or a wooden button. So wherever possible, try to give first-hand experience, use real-life objects and try to be. And this is the teaching resource that you may produce on your own, or you may use professional resources that are available at Paris Association for the Blind. This resource is used to explain the concept of right and left. As you remember from our previous discussion, it might be problematic even for teenagers, or maybe not for adult learners, but for some teenagers, to understand the difference between west and east, south and north, or right and left. So this is the resource that might be very, very helpful. Once again, mind you that first of all, you need to make sure that a student understands the concept correctly in his native language before you introduce this concept in English or in any other foreign language. And this is just the final thought. What comes up to my mind when I think about, successful blind students, these are the words produced by Helen Adams Keller. She was a famous American deafblind writer, graduated from Radcliffe College and actually the first deafblind woman who obtained her PhD degree. He achieved a great success, not on her own, but with the help of lots of people, but primarily her great teacher, Anne Sullivan. Both of them are portrayed in this picture. If you are interested in finding more information about Helen Keller, have a look at these two websites. There is also a wonderful movie about Helen Keller. And I think it's really worth watching the movie to see how she actually discovered the language, how she learned the language from the very, very beginning, being deaf and blind at the same time. So my final thought is the public must learn that the blind man is neither genius nor a freak nor an idiot. He has a mind that can be educated, a hand which can be trained, ambitions which it is right for him to strive to realize, and it is the duty of the public to help him make the best of himself so that he can win life. Well, thank you for your attention. If you are interested in the topic, you may find a very interesting book outline. It's actually kind of a guidebook with guidelines for foreign language teachers. Uczyć z dysfunkcją wzroku na lekcji angielskiego by Professor Marek and Professor Krzeszowski and Agnieszka Piskorowska. I highly recommend the book.